January 1942. The North Atlantic. Periscope depth. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan, commander of the German submarine U-123, peered through his attack periscope. The seas off the coast of America were calm. In the distance, the lights of New York City were still blazing, illuminating the silhouettes of the merchant ships passing by. To Hartigan, it looked like a shooting gallery. He lined up his crosshairs on a slow, lumbering freighter. It was ugly. It had a blunt nose, a flat deck, and looked more like a bathtub than a ship. It was steaming in a straight line, unescorted, unprotected. Tube 1, loss. The torpedo hissed out of the tube. 40 seconds later, a plume of water and fire erupted against the steel hull of the freighter. The ship broke its back instantly. As it began to slide beneath the waves, Hartigan watched the crew scrambling for lifeboats. He laughed. It was too easy. This was the second happy time for the U-boat crews. They were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. In 1942 alone, U-boats would sink over 1,600 Allied ships. They were strangling Great Britain. They were starving the Soviet Union. The German High Command had done the math. They knew exactly how many tons of shipping the British and American shipyards could produce in a month, and they knew they were sinking double that amount. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the head of the U-boat arm, wrote in his diary, "The enemy has no answer. Their ships are slow. Their production is limited. We will starve them into submission before the year is out." The Germans mocked the Allied merchant fleet. They called the new American emergency ships ugly ducklings. They called them floating coffins. They believed that no matter how hard the Americans tried, they could never build ships fast enough to replace the ones exploding in the Atlantic. They were right about the ships being ugly. They were right about them being slow, but they were wrong about the math. Because while the Germans were calculating based on traditional shipbuilding where a ship took 6 months to build, a man named Kaiser was rewriting the rules of reality in California. He wasn't building ships like artisans. He was building them like cars. And soon, the U-boat captains would look through their periscopes and see something terrifying. Not a destroyer, not a battleship, but a horizon filled with so many ugly ducklings that they didn't have enough torpedoes to sink them all. This is the story of the Liberty ship. It is the story of the industrial miracle that built a bridge of steel across the Atlantic. It is the story of the SS Stephen Hopkins, a slow cargo ship that fought a German warship to the death. And it is the story of how welding torches and rivets defeated the wolf packs. The Germans laughed at the ugly ships until they realized they were drowning in them. This is Forgotten Thunder. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories of how industrial might crushed fascism, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Forgotten Thunder. We dig deep into the archives every week to bring you the history they left out of the textbooks. Join the ranks and let's keep history alive. To understand the Liberty ship, you have to understand the desperation of 1940. Great Britain was an island under siege. It imported 55 million tons of food and supplies every year. By late 1940, the U-boats had cut that lifeline. Britain was starving. They had millions of men, but no steel. They had airplanes, but no fuel. They needed ships. But British shipyards were being bombed by the Luftwaffe, and they were already at maximum capacity building warships. So, the British sent a desperate mission to the United States. They brought blueprints for a simple 10,000-ton tramp steamer. It was an old design from 1879. It was slow 11 knots maximum. It was coal-fired. It was obsolete. They asked the Americans to build 60 of them. The American shipbuilders laughed. The established yards Newport News, Bethlehem Steel were busy building destroyers and cruisers for the U.S. Navy. They didn't want to waste their time on a 19th century tramp steamer. Enter Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder, he was a construction magnate. He had built the Hoover Dam. He had paved roads in Cuba. He knew nothing about ships. He had never launched a boat in his life, but he knew about mass production when he looked at the British blueprints. He didn't see a ship. He saw a concrete block. He saw a problem of volume. "I can build these," Kaiser told the Maritime Commission, "and I can build them faster than anyone has ever built anything." The naval architects rolled their eyes. In 1940, building a cargo ship took about 240 days. It was an art form. You laid the keel, and then hundreds of skilled workers built the ship piece by piece, rivet by rivet, from the ground up. Kaiser said, "Forget that, we're going to prefabricate." His idea was radical. Instead of building the ship on the slipway, he would build the parts of the ship all over the country. A factory in Denver would build the bow. A factory in Pittsburgh would build the engine. A factory in California would build the descassatias. Then, they would ship all the giant pieces to the shipyard, pick them up with massive cranes, and weld them together like a giant Lego set. He called it assembly line shipbuilding. President Roosevelt looked at the design. It was modified from the British version of oil, fired instead of coal, but still simple. It had a blunt nose and a flat bottom. "It consists of a hull and a steam engine," Roosevelt said. "It is a dreadful-looking object." The press picked up the quote. They called it the ugly duckling. The Time magazine called it a seagoing scow. But Roosevelt knew that ugly didn't matter. Numbers mattered. On September 27, 1941, the first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched out. At the launch ceremony, Roosevelt quoted Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty, or give me death." The Liberty ship was born. It was 441 feet long. It could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, that's 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition, and Kaiser promised he could build them fast. But nobody, not the Germans, not the British, not even Roosevelt, knew how fast. The problem with Kaiser's plan wasn't steel. It was people. In 1941, all the skilled shipwrights were already working. The young men were being drafted into the Army and the Marines. There was nobody left to weld the plates. He hired everyone else. He hired farmers. He hired shopkeepers. He hired artists. And, most controversially, he hired women. Before 1941, a woman in a shipyard was unheard of. It was considered bad luck. It was men's work. Kaiser opened the gates. Women flooded in. They became Rosie the Riveters, though on Liberty ships. They were mostly Wanda the Welders. At the Richmond shipyards in California and the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, the workforce transformed. It was a melting pot. African Americans, who had been barred from many industries, were hired by the thousands. They weren't trained shipbuilders. They were given 2 weeks of training on how to lay a bead of weld and then sent to the hull. The Germans laughed at this, too. German intelligence reports from 1942 mocked the American workforce. Asterisk, the Americans are using housewives and jazz musicians to build their ships. Asterisk, a Kriegsmarine report noted. Asterisk, the quality will be atrocious. These ships will fall apart in a stiff breeze. It is a desperate measure by a desperate nation. Asterisk, and initially there were problems. Welding was a new technology for ships. Previously, ships were riveted metal pins hammered into holes. Riveting allowed the ship to flex in the waves. Welding fused the steel into one solid piece. If the weld was brittle, or if the steel had impurities, a crack could start in the hull and travel around the entire ship in seconds, snapping it in half. This happened. The SS Schenectady, a T-2 tanker built using the same methods, cracked in half while sitting at the dock in calm water. The loud bang sounded like a cannon shot. The press went wild. Kaiser's Coffins? They screamed, but the engineers figured it out. They added crack, arresters riveted straps of steel that would stop a crack from spreading. They improved the steel quality, and they kept building. They didn't slow down. They sped up. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. By 1942, they got it down to 70 days. Then 50 days. Kaiser turned shipbuilding into a competition. He pitted his shipyards against each other. If the Oregon yard built a ship in 40 days, the Richmond yard wanted to do it in 38. This brings us to one of the most insane records in industrial history. Asterisk, asterisk, in November 1942. Kaiser wanted a stunt. He wanted to show the Germans and the Washington bureaucrats just what American industry could do. He ordered the Richmond Shipyard No. 2 to build a Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, as fast as physically possible. They pre-assembled everything. They had the cranes ready. At 12:01 a.m. on Sunday, November 8th, they laid the keel. Hundreds of workers swarmed the hull. Welders worked in shifts, the sparks never stopping by Monday. The hull was taking shape by Tuesday. The engine was dropped in by Wednesday. The deck houses were on November 12th at 3:30 p.m. The ship was launched, for days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, from a pile of steel plates to a floating ship in less than a week. It was a propaganda. When the news reached Germany, Hitler reportedly refused to believe it. He claimed it was a Hollywood trick. He said it was impossible to paint a ship in 4 days, let alone build one, but it wasn't a trick. The ship sailed. It served in the Pacific and Atlantic. It survived the war. The ugly duckling had become a monster of production, while the factories were breaking records. The sailors were facing a nightmare. The story of the merchant marine is often overlooked, but they suffered a higher casualty rate than the U.S. Army or Navy. If you want to honor their sacrifice, hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people who need to know the cost of freedom. They still had to sail, and the Atlantic Ocean in 1942 was a graveyard. The German U-boat fleet, commanded by Admiral Dönitz, had reorganized. They were operating in wolf packs, groups of 10 or 20 submarines that would swarm a convoy at night. A Liberty ship was defenseless. It had a top speed of 11 knots. A U-boat on the surface could do 17 knots. The Liberty ship carried a 3-inch or 5-inch gun on the stern, USUALLY, manned by a specialized Navy crew called the Armed Guard. But hitting a submarine at night, in high seas, was nearly impossible. The service on a Liberty ship was terrifying. You were sleeping on top of 10,000 tons of explosives or aviation fuel. If a torpedo hit, you didn't just sink, you vaporized. There are stories of Liberty ships, like the SS Paul Hamilton. When it was hit by a German torpedo in the Mediterranean, the ammunition in the hold detonated. The explosion was so massive, it shattered windows 7 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 1,000 feet. Of the 580 men on board, not a single body was ever found. The ship simply ceased to exist. In a microsequence D. German U-boat captains referred to the Liberty ships as floating targets. They were slow. They smoked the oil boilers produced a dark smoke that could be seen for miles, and they were everywhere. Captain Peter Creamer of U-333 recalled, "They were ugly beasts, boxy, clumsy. We laughed at them. We would surface and use the deck gun to save torpedoes. It felt like shooting cows in a field. But as 1942 turned into 1943, the laughter began to fade. Because for every ship Creamer sank, 2 more appeared. The Germans would sink a ship in the morning. By the afternoon, a new ship, built in 4 days in California, was being loaded in New York to replace it. It became a war of attrition, a war of numbers, and while the Liberty ships were technically defenseless, the men aboard them were not. They were civilians, Union sailors, merchant mariners, but they developed a hatred for the U-boats that turned them into warriors. And one ship in particular would prove that an ugly duckling could fight like a dragon. September 27, 1942, the South Atlantic, the SS Stephen Hopkins, was a standard Liberty ship. It was steaming alone, sailing from Cape Town to Dutch Guiana. It was empty, running in ballast. Commanding the ship was Captain Paul Buck. Commanding the small Navy Armed Guard detachment was Ensign Kenneth Willett. They were in the middle of nowhere. The weather was hazy. Suddenly, out of the mist, 2 ships appeared. They weren't Allied ships. One was the Steyr, a German heavy commerce raider. The Steyr was a wolf in sheep's clothing. It looked like a merchant ship, but hidden behind false bulkheads were 6 5.9-inch naval guns, torpedo tubes, and automatic cannons. It was a warship disguised as a freighter, designed to hunt down lonely ships like the Hopkins. The second ship was its supply vessel, the Tannenfels. The German captain of the Steyr, Horst Gerlach, saw the Liberty ship. He ordered his men to drop the camouflage and open fire. He expected the Americans to surrender immediately. That was the protocol. A Liberty ship cannot fight a raider. Captain Buck on the Hopkins looked at the raider. He knew he was outgunned. He had 1 4-inch gun on the stern, a relic from World War I, and a few machine guns. But Buck didn't hoist the white flag. He turned the stern of his ship toward the Germans to present the smallest target, and he gave the order, General Quarters, open fire. What followed was one of the most ferocious surface battles of the war. And it wasn't fought by battleships. It was fought by a cargo ship. The Steyr opened up with its main battery. Shells smashed into the Hopkins. The bridge was hit. The radio room was destroyed before they could send an SOS, but the Americans fired back. Ensign Willett ran to the stern gun. The gun crew was mostly young Navy boys, some seeing combat for the first time. They loaded the 4-inch gun and began to pump shells into the German raider. They didn't miss. The first American shell hit the Steyr's steering gear, jamming her rudder. The German ship was stuck turning in circles. The second shell hit the German engine room. The Germans were shocked. This ugly duckling was biting back. They unleashed everything. They had torpedoes, heavy cannons, machine guns. The Stephen Hopkins was being torn apart. The boiler exploded. The superstructure was on fire. Ensign Willett was wounded in the stomach by shrapnel, but he kept directing the fire. "Keep shooting," he screamed. "Don't let them sink us for free." The men on the .50 caliber machine guns raked the deck of the German ship, killing the gun crews. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The Stephen Hopkins was a burning wreck, sinking by the stern. Captain Buck gave the order to abandon ship. But as the survivors drifted in the lifeboats, they watched something incredible. The German raider Steyr was also burning. The ugly duckling had punched so many holes in the warship that she was doomed. As the Hopkins slipped beneath the waves, the German captain ordered his own crew to abandon ship. He scuttled the Steyr, a lone Liberty ship with a single antique gun. Had engaged a heavily armed German warship and sank it. Captain Buck, Ensign Willett, and 40 members of the crew died, but they took the raider with them. It was the only time in the war that a merchant ship sank a surface raider. This story of the Stephen Hopkins is the definition of forgotten thunder. These men weren't supposed to fight. They were supposed to run, but they stood their ground. If you think their story deserves to be remembered, verify your subscription right now. We want to tell more stories like this. By 1943, the miracle was complete. The U-boats were still dangerous, but they were losing the math war. In 1942, the U-boats sank 8 million tons of shipping, but the American shipyards built 10 million tons in 1943. The U-boats sank 3 million tons. The Americans built 19 million tons. Henry Kaiser's factories were pumping out 3 Liberty ships every single day. Admiral Dönitz looked at the charts in his headquarters in Berlin. The lines had crossed. The red line of ships sunk was going down. The blue line of ships built was going vertical. It didn't matter how brave his U-boat captains were. It didn't matter how many torpedoes they fired. There were simply too many targets. The Liberty ships formed a steel bridge across the Atlantic. They carried the tanks that fought at El Alamein. They carried the rails and locomotives that the Soviet Union used to supply the Eastern Front. They carried the millions of men who invaded Normandy on D-Day. In fact, at Normandy, 2 Liberty ships were intentionally sunk off the beaches to create a breakwater and artificial harbor. Even in death, they served the mission. The Germans had called them floating coffins. But by 1944, they were the coffin nails of the Third Reich. Every time a German soldier saw a Sherman tank, or ate a can of Spam, or got strafed by AP-47, he was seeing the result of a Liberty ship. The industrial might of the United States had been turned into a weapon, and that weapon was a slow, ugly, welded box that refused to stop coming by the end of the war. 2,710 Liberty ships had been built. It remains the largest production run of a single ship design in history. But what happened to them? They were built to last only 5 years. They were considered expendable. After the war, thousands of them were mothballed. They sat in ghost fleets in rivers in Virginia, California, and Texas. Rows and rows of rusting hulks. Most were sold for scrap. The steel from the Liberty ships was melted down and used to build the skyscrapers and cars of the 1950s. The razor blade you used this morning might contain atoms from the hull of a ship that fought a U-boat. But a few survived, only to remain operational. The SS John W. Brown in Baltimore and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. If you visit them, you will see how crude they are. The welds are rough. The quarters are cramped. The engine is a simple triple expansion steam engine technology that was old when the Titanic sailed, but standing on the deck, you can feel the history. These ships weren't pretty. They weren't fast. They weren't sophisticated, but they were the physical manifestation of a nation's will. Germans laughed at the ugly ducklings. They thought that war was about elite warriors and superior technology. They thought a Tiger tank or a U-boat was the pinnacle of power. They forgot that war is also about logistics. They forgot that quantity has a quality all its own. And they forgot that you should never laugh at an ugly ship until you see what's inside the hold, because inside the hold of the Liberty ship was the end of the Nazi Empire. This is forgotten thunder. The weapons they laughed at, the stories they forgot.